Howdy everybody, welcome back. It's Thomas here once again. Today, well, we did that. We got Phantom Strider. Today we got things everyone did 100 years ago, but are now illegal. And why they're illegal. So yeah, guess we're having a blast from the past, literally. So we're about to see what we could have done 100 years ago, but now we can't because it's got banned, at least. Not sure what, but, well, we're about to find out. I mean, I wasn't alive back then, so I never done any of these, I think. We're about to find out. So be sure to like, subscribe for more. Hope you enjoy. Let's see what happened.
Howdy.
Howdy.
Let's step back 100 years ago, into the roaring 20s. Most guys wore suit jackets, and ladies, sometimes called flappers, often donned knee-length sleeveless dresses and stockings. People also had a much lower life expectancy, around 50 in the USA, and there were some downright shocking things that people did. Perfectly normal 100 years ago, but very illegal now. And I'd like to explore with you just how much the world has changed. These are the things that
I wonder where the
everyone did 100
SpongeBob
years
episode
ago,
did
but are
there.
now
You know,
illegal.
the old school
Let's
style?
start with number
Alright,
8.
just stay first. What do you got?
Heroin was sold as an over-the-counter drug. A warning ahead, this is
Ain't
really
that addictive
weird
nowadays?
and messed up, and certainly not meant to promote drugs. Although nowadays we know that heroin is a highly addictive, illegal, and dangerous drug.
Yep.
Back in the 1910s and 20s, it was actually seen as a harmless cough medicine you could get from the pharmacy. It was even advertised for children. Heroin was first introduced in 1898 alongside aspirin. The word heroin came from the German word meaning heroic and strong. Because, you know, when I'm convulsing and vomiting sprawled on the floor in an undignified mess about to go into a coma, that's just how I feel. Heroic. You see, it was the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Germany that first introduced this quote-unquote cough medicine. And they were mighty pleased with their concoction. And they were quick to begin advertising their new cough medicine. Yeah, organizations like the FDA had only just been introduced in 1906, and they were definitely not as good at being watchdogs back then. In fact, in the 1900s, morphine was a common recreational drug. You know, the one they used to bring emergency relief to people in the hospital room. So Bayer's heroin was advertised as a quote-unquote non-addictive morphine substitute. I don't know what they were thinking.
If only they knew.
Nowadays, of course,
if only they knew.
Heroin was one of the most addictive drugs in the world. The children's heroin advertising campaign began in Spanish newspapers, such as this ad, urging the use of heroina to treat bronchitis in kids. Here, we see a mum spoon-feeding heroin to her sickly little girl. The ad reads, La tos desaparece, which means the cough disappears. Yeah, the cough disappears because your child potentially stops breathing. Oh, geez, sorry, this is messed up stuff. Unsurprisingly, reports began to surface as patients were, shocker, developing a tolerance for the highly addictive drug. And addicts in the US were clamoring for more of this cough medicine. Fortunately,
that's the
FDA
problem.
finally got their crap together enough by 1914
Just cannot keep the
to at least
effectiveness.
make heroin
So,
prescription
more,
only. And Congress finally put their foot down by 1924, banning heroin's sale, manufacture, or importation. The drug was such a wide-scale disaster that the Anti-Heroin Act was introduced. So as much as some people might complain about the FDA nowadays, before they existed, it was a wild west. There was no watchdog. Companies could basically sell anything to anyone.
Pretty much whatever
no matter
you want.
how dangerous, just to hell with the consequences. As of 2024, the FDA considers heroin a Class 1 substance, and it's completely illegal even in medicine or hospitals. In my country, Australia, the maximum penalty for supplying heroin is like 25 years in prison. So maybe try a deep breath and a stick of gum instead.
True. Could be worse.
Number 7.
But I took it back.
Corporal punishment. In case you don't know,
AKA teachers hitting
punishment
students.
means causing physical pain to someone in response to an undesirable behavior. At some point, almost all children misbehave, and it's a tough challenge for every parent on how to discipline their kids. Back in the 1920s, the term spare the rod, spoil the child was much more common.
My school is a model of discipline. Use the rod, beat the child. That's my motto.
Terrific motto.
And we'll get to the true meaning of that phrase later. Corporal punishment can include many things, from a smack to a child, to a wooden paddle to a student, or even a whipping or a flogging to a prisoner.
Sheesh.
Here in Australia, back when our ancestors were all convicts, they were flogged for misbehaving a lot. But over in American schools, a wooden paddle was used to hit children on the behind.
like that.
This was known as a paddling.
Looking out the window, that's a paddling.
While I don't have experience with paddling, over here in Australia,
Yeah,
our
I have
students
never been
received
paddled.
a
I'm good.
caning, aka the strap. This was essentially a long piece of leather that would strike the
Sometimes
hand of a
the
child.
belt.
I was listening to the story of an old Aussie teacher from the 80s who was in charge of giving his students the strap. One time, a child was sent to his office for answering back. They were to receive 2 strikes across the hand with the strap.
Like,
he was preparing
this side
to
or
strike
this
the child,
side?
warning them it would hurt. But he couldn't get himself to do it, so he thumped the strap loudly on the wooden desk. This was enough to get the child to scream and wet their pants. From then on, all the 5 to 8-year-olds ran from him whenever he was on yard duty. It left a mark on the child and him, and he decided to never use or pretend to use a strap again. Nowadays, in most states, physical punishments in the schoolyard are illegal, and will almost certainly result in a teacher being fired or suspended. That being said, even today, the World Health Organization found that 60% of children aged 2 to 14 years still receive physical punishment by a caregiver. So bear with me here, let's try and acknowledge both sides, because this is an important issue. What do the naysayers think? In some older crowds, some of who may have received paddlings and hittings in their childhood, they may still say, kids are too soft now, we were hard and stronger back then because we got hit as children.
Oof.
Well, probably not in those exact words, but you get what I mean. And you know, I
Yeah.
think a lot of people really do believe this. So I did a lot of research on this, and I found as of 2024, we have over 100 years of empirical research showing the long-term effects of physical punishment on children.
Well,
these studies were done by teachers, parents, social workers, psychologists, doctors, the World Health Organization, you name it. And the majority of these studies suggest, although physical punishment might work in the short term, it can also result in long-term defiance and aggression in children. For example, one study found that physically punished kids were more likely to fear their parents. They were also more likely to bully other children, have lower self-esteem, be aggressive, and perhaps most obviously, it can teach them that hitting is okay.
That's
no good.
Anyway, that's enough boring you with empirical evidence. Time for a
Makes
fun
sense.
fact to finish off.
Good.
In reality, the term spare the rod and spoil the child was not meant to refer
Best
to
quote.
disciplining a child, but rather it's from a 360-year-old poem called Hudibras, where in
Hudibras,
fact a man is
okay.
requesting from his lover that she,
Spank him?
If you think kinks are a new occurrence in history, you don't know the true meaning of spare the rod and spoil the child.
So, the child in that case wasn't a child, it was actually a dude who had a kink? The more you learn, I guess. I mean, like I said, I never really got spanked, but, jeez. Really makes you wonder. Oy, oy, oy. So, what explained the bullies, I guess? I mean, they smack at home, they had to smack at... I'm gonna stop there. Ay, ay, ay. I mean, did you guys ever get paddling, spanked, whatever? Let me know. I mean, nowadays, I feel like... I mean, they claim we're soft, but at least we're mentally sounder, I guess. You know? At least that's how I see it, so... You got me. Again, I never got spanked, so I can't say. Moving along, number 6.
And number 6.
Okay.
Radioactive, arsenic, and mercury beauty products.
Oh.
Yeah, again, the FDA
You can
was
see
still
where
getting
this
their
one's
crap
going.
together. So some downright
Basically,
stupid
products
beauty
that lead
products
to
got
long-term health
frequently
problems.
used. We gotta first check out these arsenic complexion wafers, because jeebus, what were they thinking with these? Priced at
Arsenic.
only £1. Oh boy. Luckily, the National Museum of America kept a copy of these arsenic wafers. Made from 1916 through to 1928.
12 years.
What did our ancestors use these for? Why, for their
Snacks?
facial complexions, of course.
Oh,
Let's
I was about to
start by
say
reading
snacks
the
or something
box.
with wafers.
Dr. Mackenzie's improved harmless arsenic complexion wafers. They will produce the most lovely complexion that the imagination could desire.
basically
It's
beauty
clear,
product there.
fresh, free from blotch, blemish, coarseness, redness, freckles, or pimples.
Well, you sold me, buddy. Lucky you added to the
I'm good.
title that they're harmless. Otherwise, I'd assume you were trying to kill me. The wafers worked by making the
Yeah.
skin fashionably pale, as this arsenic concoction destroyed red blood cells. Interestingly, the quote-unquote attractive young look in the 20s was to look as pale as a ghost. You look like a ghost to look younger? How does that work? But as you
I
might
mean,
have
to be
guessed,
fair, they
customers
had
weren't always
that
satisfied
during the Mid
or
Ages,
alive.
since you know
Sadly,
how
there
to.
were multiple deaths. For example, Hildegard of St. Louis died after taking several boxes of wafers. Innocently enough, they were
same
just
day?
trying to clear up a skin complaint. In another case, the Indianapolis Sentinel reported,
The young lady
Gradually
gradually lost her sight
sight.
after taking arsenic skin wafers. Her engagement was on hold as they tried to get her sight restored.
Then we have Gorad's Oriental Mercury Cream. Truly
Yep,
American.
hello,
but
Mercury.
anyone would touch this without gloves.
This cream will beauty the skin and work like magic.
Ooh, magic. Is there a touch of fairy dust? No,
No.
just lots of calomel, a mercury compound. Over time,
Basically,
the mercury
don't use
poisoned
mercury.
our 20s ancestors. Though they could wear the cream once or twice without ill effects. Over time,
Yep.
they might develop dark rings around the eyes, loose teeth, and black gums. Ugh, all in the name of beauty. Somehow, this cream was available for decades. But finally, in 1938, the FDA was allowed to regulate cosmetics. And as you can guess, they very quickly banned mercury skin cream.
Thank
and
you.
finally, in 1898, Mary Curie and Pierre's discovery of radium came along, and our ancestors were promised a positively glowing complexion, possibly burning a hole through the floor. At the time, no one realized the extreme dangers of radiation. In fact, they thought a heavy dose of radiation was a good thing. So they found all sorts of commercial uses for radium. In fact, by
Poor
the
Curie.
1920s, there
Yeah,
was a
radioactive
craze for radium
toothpaste.
products. Normally, this
Clocks.
radium was
There's
injected
a lot of
or
radium.
taken in pills. Oh, jeepers, why? Radium was used to treat hair loss, impotence, gout, and so many more things. When the scientific method existed, how could we do this? Did no one say maybe we should check if this stuff was dangerous? So what was the name of this world-famous product? Radior. Nin's gonna read this
Yeah.
1918 Radior
Go ahead, Nin.
advertisement to you word for word because it's hard to fathom now.
An ever-flowing fountain of youth and beauty has at last been found in the energy rays of radium. Radium rays vitalize and energize all living tissue. Honey, this is too stupid to read.
Well,
Wow,
I'm sorry.
she's like,
Apparently the
I don't wanna
scientific
do this,
method
I don't
was
wanna do this.
blatantly ignored for what we
I
stuck
mean,
on
she
our
usually
face.
does it all the way,
Anyway,
but
I
here
think you
she's
get the
like,
picture.
"Nuh-uh,
The
that's enough.
highly radiated picture.
That's enough."
Needless to say, if someone tries to sell someone arsenic, mercury, or radioactive products now, they're likely to go to jail for both fraud and attempted murder. And for
Pretty
number
much.
5,
I'm good. Thank you.
almost all marriages,
Marriages were often
forced
forced or arranged.
In the early 1900s,
Sheesh.
romance
That was
almost
the
didn't
1800s, not
exist. It was a
1900s.
very new concept. For all of previous recorded human history, humans tended to marry for practical or financial reasons, or they were coerced into marriage with physical violence
Like-
or subtle psychological pressure from families. Back then, it was just a procedure and there was no romance involved. And marriage usually involved the legal transfer of dependency of the woman from her father to the groom. There.
Yeah, you
But
see where that's
sadly,
going.
That was life 110 years ago. There wasn't so much dating as there was courtship, where a male suitor would be encouraged by their family to call upon a woman. He'd meet for a supervised visit to her place, meet the parents, and talk to the lady in the family parlor, in what must have been the most unromantic, boring date in the history of humankind. An example of a more directly forced wedding is a shotgun wedding, where the bride and groom were forced to marry, sometimes under the threat of being shot. Oftentimes, the lady was pregnant, and some religions see having children out of wedlock as violating their religious laws. A child out of wedlock is where
Yeah,
the
you
B
can see
word
where that's
comes from.
going.
Fortunately, over time, with the improvements in women's rights in most developed countries, we saw some major improvements and overhauls of marriage laws, where both men and women were treated equally and no one owned anyone. People began to marry because they wanted to marry, because they liked each other. And if either wanted to, they were always free to divorce and go their separate ways.
Honey, if we divorce someday, I hope we stay good friends.
Yeah, me too, hun. I'd so
Wait, why are
wish
you bringing
we
it up?
didn't. In regards to different marriage types,
Also,
although there's
notice
meant to
them
be a
that's like
difference
new
between
animations
arranged
too.
marriages and forced marriages, the line of difference can be difficult to draw, as arranged marriages often have severe family social pressure behind them.
Yeah.
In older generations, it was seen as mandatory to obey parents, whether they were decent or horrible people. Of course, nowadays, the United Nations sees forced marriages as human rights abuse, and most
Well, unless
developed
you're Middle
countries
East, that's
have
still
made
going on
forced
nowadays.
marriages a criminal offense.
Yeah, to say it.
But I am happy to say, by the 1920s, romance had just started to bloom and courtship had just started to be replaced by dating. Some people called this the Jazz Age courtship. Couples could go down to speakeasies to drink, perhaps listen to a jazz band, dance a bit, and maybe finish with some petting and necking in a speakeasy booth. In fact, there's some reports of necking parties scandalizing the nation. Perhaps the beginning of hickeys? Guess.
Yeah,
what if
probably.
She has a job interview tomorrow. Well, I
Ooh-wee.
guess that's what turtlenecks are for.
But when
Yeah,
do
it
two
sounds
people
right.
ever really love each other, as we do?
Number 4.
Nice little callback there.
Child labor. Federal laws to ban child labor are a disturbingly modern thing. Congress failed to pass a
Yeah.
bill to lower children's working hours in
What, they're not gratuitous?
1916.
What?
In the USA, child labor wasn't even regulated until the 1938 Fair Labor Act. Before that, you better bet your kids could go
Yikes.
work in the coal mines. They can't just be sitting around getting an education or, even worse, having fun. But by the time they get to 6 to 10 years old, they could be earning their keep, making the family more prosperous. They could be plowing the fields, helping with livestock, or working at factories. This extra set of hands encouraged many parents to drop their kids out of school to start them working full time. I may make fun, but back then, many families genuinely needed the income earned by their children to survive. Otherwise, there was no food on the table. That's part of why it used to be seen as economic to have 7 kids instead of 1 or 2. Also, a portion of your kids were likely to die. Remind me why these are called
Yeah, the infant
good
mortality
old
rate,
days
my
again?
friends.
But back then, it
It's
was
rough.
just the norm. In fact, the 1900 census suggests that almost 2 million US kids aged 10 to
Jeez,
15
2 million.
were working full-time jobs. Some were even working night shifts lasting 12 hours. But as of 1999, federal law prohibits full-time workers under the age of 16. So nowadays, it would be very illegal to tell your child, "Hey, Junior, we're dropping you out of school to go work in the coal mines." But the silent
Then
and
again,
GI
coal mines aren't
generation
really
were
that
taught to
problem
never
nowadays.
question authority.
Are they?
Fortunately, with the partial rise in household income and the availability of schools, kids started to spend more time in schools and playing and less time in full-time jobs. And it's worth mentioning, although child labor is frowned upon by most of the world nowadays,
Sure, most.
20% of children in sub-Saharan Africa still work full-time jobs. Many of these jobs are hazardous to their health. India and Ecuador have similar problems. Our world's got a long way to go, but I think it's important to acknowledge the world's improvements too. And for lucky number...
Yeah, you gotta admit, a lot of those times, like, they were just doing what we needed to survive. Like, the arranged marriages and courtships, whatever you want to call it back then, yeah, they were kind of needed because, well, they were trying to make sure people would survive long enough. I mean, to be fair, they were rubbing mercury on themselves and, well, brushing their teeth with radium, so they weren't really that smart yet. I mean, nowadays, we've gotten smarter, and, well, I mean, nowadays we could just relax, have fun, but we still can work. We just have jobs that can, well, it's easier this time, you know? And the parents know that, well, they can't just send their kids off to a workforce yet. They gotta wait. And nowadays, and again, like you said, schools are easier to come by, and, well, you can see where that goes from here, right? Anyway.
3. Eugenics. The creepy,
boy.
racist selective breeding. Quote,
Yep.
those who proved unfit should be sterilized.
Remember, this was
End
before the
quote.
civil rights movements of
Damn,
the
that doesn't
60s,
make you
so,
uncomfortable, I don't know what
woof.
will. The goal of this eugenics selective breeding was to breed humanity into a quote-unquote better
Master race.
species through heavy discrimination. A warning ahead, this one could be
Yeah.
pretty confronting.
By the
While
way, there's no
eugenics
actual
happened
science
in
to it,
many
it's just
countries
what
like
the bigots
England
thought.
and USA. Here in Australia, we used to have the disturbing movement of quote-unquote breeding out Aboriginal blood. Ugh. The Australian government had the long-standing White Australia policy, which stood for 57 years, not ending till 1958.
Isn't that also what the evil Voldemort wanted to do? To only have a race of purebloods?
Why, yes, honey. Yes, it was. And you know,
Yikes.
the guy who wrote Mein Kampf also had his own.
Yeah, again,
eugenics
the Aryan
policy.
race!
It's in the past, but I think we can either run from it or learn from it.
You can either run from it or learn from it.
Thanks,
In
Vicky.
countries like the USA, they had marriage prohibitions and forced sterilization of people deemed unfit for reproduction. This
Yeah.
often included people of mental or physical disabilities. Oh, this is
Yeah, I'd probably be screwed back then.
And criminals and members of some minority groups. Over 64,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under this policy. This policy went on till about 1963. But back in the day, many people seemed okay with it. In 1937, a Fortune magazine poll found that 2/3 of respondents supported sterilization of mental deficient. I think you get the point. But
Yeah, can we just
unsurprisingly,
skip, please?
eugenics fell more out of favor in the 1940s. Why? Well, World War II ended in 1945.
Yeah.
And the Nazis frequently used eugenics and selective breeding to defend their mass-murdering policies. So obviously,
Yeah,
non-consensual eugenics stomps
Just like,
all over basic
nah.
human rights. But personally, I
Basically,
think
you
it's
support
the
eugenics, you support
non-consensual
Nazis.
selective breeding that's the
Good luck
problem.
trying to-
Because I think it's interesting to
Could
point
try
out
to get
nowadays
past
some
that.
consensual selective breeding does happen, but you might not necessarily consider it. For example, in a systematic review on prenatal testing, they found that 85% of pregnancies with Down syndrome resulted in the choice of ending the pregnancy. In that case, it's hurting more human rights to not allow consensual selective breeding. And of course, if we look forward to now, controlling a person's breeding is mostly illegal. Because trying to control a
Keyword
person's
mostly.
body would of course be monstrous. But at the time, this eugenics
mean,
policy
didn't
was
we just
happening
ban abortions
everywhere.
lately?
To quote the 1920s
remembered.
Judge Oliver Holmes,
No way. I can't.
Wow,
say
even
that.
she's like, nah.
society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from
Man's like,
continuing
nope,
their kind.
Bad.
Yes,
Get outta
very
here.
bad. Only you should be deciding if you continue your kind or not. Number 2.
Next up, 2.
Seatbelts were rare and hated. Nowadays,
Really?
seatbelts are so second
Hated?
nature that even Lego Wonder Woman tells her team to buckle up.
Now, seatbelts. Safety first.
But in 1920, seatbelts were non-existent. In fact, steam-powered automobiles were still a new technology. Vehicles were mostly playthings for the
Dexter,
rich,
how you doing?
apart from maybe the Model T Ford. It wasn't until the 1930s and 40s that seatbelts existed in any cars. And even then, seatbelts were a very rare and optional part of the car. In fact, many people thought they were annoying. I guess having intact heads was annoying to them too. It all started because back in the day, hospitals were seeing a huge amount of head injuries coming through the emergency room. So seatbelts were finally introduced into American cars in 1949.
Buckle up for safety. Buckle up.
But many American customers made it very clear they did not want them. Many customers requested that dealers remove them, or they just cut them out themselves. In a Nash report, they said,
Our seatbelts were met with insurmountable sales resistance.
but all over the world, car companies were finding a lot of vehicle deaths because of head injuries, such as the Swedish National Electric Company.
Vattenfall?
So another small Swedish company came along, a little company called Volvo. And they
Volvo.
started making the first seatbelts in Swedish cars. And I was quite proud to find out the first mandatory seatbelt laws came about in 1970 in my country, Australia.
Would you like a belt? Yeah, I'll take 2. 1 for each wrist.
This greatly lowered our death toll on the road. By the 1980s, America got mandatory seatbelts too, which faced great opposition again. Many consumers went to court to challenge these draconian seatbelt laws. Some continued to defy the laws by cutting seatbelts out of their cars. Those evil car companies. It's my American right to fly through my windshield. I know it's a small minority, but some of these Americans and safety, if they're not going to war over face masks, it's seatbelts.
And this is why we always wear our seatbelts. Nobody likes a backseat driver.
And for number one, smoking was advertised by doctors, and it was everywhere. And I do mean everywhere. People smoked on planes, trains, hospitals, hotels, shops, probably maternity wards. Let those sick hospital patients breathe in some of that poisonous, toxic smoke. In fact, in 1920, over 50% of men smoked cigarettes. Oh, that would have dried my nostrils and lungs.
Hello, lung cancer, anybody?
It didn't help that at the time, doctors loved to advertise smoking. Because back
even
then,
cartoons were doing it, remember?
Somehow seen as
Flintstones
healthy.
one?
By the 1920s, smoking companies had started targeting their advertising to women. So they advertised their death sticks as somehow glamorous and demonstrating independence. How? And every second movie had stars lighting up a death stick. Somehow, the ultimate sign of women's emancipation was hacking up black phlegm.
Yuck.
I concur, and sadly, the cigarette advertising worked on both men and women. Everywhere you went back in the day, people smoked like chimneys. In fact, there were entire rooms in houses, trains, ships, and just about anywhere that were dedicated to smoking. So it's no surprise when commercial flights started in 1914. Smoking was perfectly normal on a flight, and at the time, no one questioned it. In fact, it wasn't even until 1964 that the US Surgeon General released a warning on cigarettes causing lung cancer and coronary heart disease. But by then, Fred Flintstone was already advertising Winston Death Sticks. Winston Death Sticks, the original sponsors of the Flintstones. Tragically, all four voice actors for Fred, Barney, Wilma, and Betty smoked, and all four died of lung complications related to smoking. But back then, they didn't know. Vanda was the voice of Wilma, and upon her death, Vanda's son made a statement.
That cute little laugh Betty and Wilma did with their mouths closed. My mum came up with that, because when they laughed normally, being smokers, they coughed.
Fortunately, nowadays,
the smokers' lung
smoking are well documented. In Australia, we have the Tobacco Advertising Prohibition Act, and in the USA, the FDA watches the tobacco companies like a hawk. Speaking as someone in the 90s who did a 12-hour flight next to a chain smoker, I was so relieved when secondhand smoking began to be cracked down upon, for the sake of those around the smokers. I couldn't stand that stuff. Ugh.
Speaking as an ex-smoker, I'm relieved they banned smoking on flights. No one wants to breathe in someone else's smoke.
Yeah, especially with the cabin pressure.
It's funny to me how some people see 100 years ago as a quote-unquote good old days. Back in the 1920s, nearly 10% of all kids died within their first year. As opposed to now, where the infant mortality rate is more like 0.5%. It's not perfect, but it's damn well better than before. Even your most basic food is going to be way cleaner and safer to eat now than back then. With that said, thanks for listening to my ramble, and hope I might see you next time. Today we have a fun...
Yeah, I'll be real. Like, if they claim the good old days, I'd be like, dude, you allowed smoking and radium-laced toothpaste. I'm willing to go grab something if you want to keep that up. Honestly, if anyone ever said that, I think I'd just point to that and be like, you sure about that, partner? You sure about that? I mean, harsh, but come on. You know I'm right. Well, anyway, let me know what you guys think, and until next time, like, subscribe for more. Let me know if you guys remember any of this. Adios.